So Juan Francisco Estrada emerges victorious in a fight in which, well, I'd say the second fight in a row against Chocolatito, where he, to some extent, received the benefit of the doubt, albeit a bit more doubt in this case than in the second fight, with the fact that Chocolatito and his slow start eventually ended up costing him the fight on the judges' scorecards, where he was given none of the first 5 rounds. And Estrada managed to emerge victorious due to a late rally in which Chocolatito was able to close the gap, certainly in between rounds 7 through 11, I believe, on the judges' cards as well. When I ended up scoring the fight afterwards, I basically had already come into the fight knowing what the narrative was afterwards, which is that Estrada put in a more convincing performance. And even to those who had scored the fight for Chocolatito, as this was a somewhat hotly debated fight in regards to the scoring, there's varying scorecards really going either way. There's people crying robbery, and there's others arguing that Estrada beat Chocolatito in the trilogy far more convincingly than I suppose they would think a lot of people would like to acknowledge. So I went and scored the fight. Had round 1 and 2 for Estrada. I thought the first round was clear. I thought the second round was close. A little bit of a swing round. Third round was a clear Choco round. Rounds 4 through 6 were all clear Estrada rounds. And rounds 7 through 11 were Chocolatito rounds, with the 11th round being a swing round and the 12th round being an Estrada round, as he managed to close the fight very, very strongly after he seemed to be coming apart a little bit in the subsequent rounds after that excellent first half, where in my view he picked up a 5-1 advantage. Estrada, I will say, definitely turned in a more convincing performance in this fight. The keys for him were his even more exacerbated lateral movement, and the fact that he was forcing Choco to use his definitely declining legs at this point, because, Choco is obviously aging, and his legs were quicker, when he was at 108 and 112 pounds. Since he's moved up to 115 pounds, and obviously the wear and tear started to build up, his feet have progressively started to slow, and he's a little bit less effective in regards to cutting the ring off. So in the early rounds, Choco was not able to move as seamlessly and as free-flowingly as we're typically used to seeing him, where he's able to track opponents down and use his lateral movement and cut angles and prevent and keep opponents on the ropes and keep them from being able to sidestep and exercise their angles. Choco was definitely off to a very shaky start. His jab was a bit of a non-factor in this fight. Somewhat of an underutilized weapon, I think, for Chocolatito in some of his fights against movers. Even early in his career against Francisco Rosas, and then later on he fought Cuadras and even lacked a bit of a jab in that fight. Was able to nevertheless outwork him and land the sharper and cleaner sort of shots on the inside, but nevertheless, I felt he definitely underutilized it in this fight, as I think Martinez, especially in the previous fight where Choco, turned in a bit of a clinic, and as we saw from Martinez's performance, his confidence seems to be sapped from taking that beat down. He wasn't really required to use it, because all he really needed to do to close the distance was just slip, parry, and then sort of inch his way inward against someone who is far less, far more flat-footed. Estrada was using very similar amounts of movement to what he was using in the first fight, but his upper body was far more busy. His jab, in my view, was the best it had ever seen, and really, in terms of overall performance and his exhibition of skills, this is the most complete performance I've ever seen Juan Francisco Estrada exhibit in a boxing ring, and this includes the first Srisaket Rongvisai fight. Rongvisai fought out of the orthodox stance, which completely altered the dynamics of the fight. And simultaneously, he's never been a guy who can cut off the ring himself. He pushes opponents back via intimidating them with his power. Therefore, he can get their respect, and his counterpunching and relatively quick hands allows for him to capitalize and counterpunch when they need to close the distance and get in range to land on Rongfasai. So I felt much more was demanded of him in order to close the distance and keep Choco at bay in this fight than, say, it was in that fight, or the Malindo fight, or the Segura fight, or any one of those. Choco, ultimately, after the first 5 rounds, began to get desperate, as he was trying to be rather economical. He was looking to sort of pot shot and counterpunch him at long distance, and catch Estrada, dropping his hands. He definitely didn't use a ton of pre-slip, so I think he was looking to counterpunch with, wider hooks. But eventually he started to get desperate. And in round 7, he started to turn things up and really, really shifted the tide of the fight. His body shots, his far more impactful and more noticeable and eye-catching punches began to take their toll, I think, on Estrada, as Estrada himself was starting to lose composure and come apart a little bit due to the pressure. Estrada's hand speed was definitely still causing problems for Choco, and he was definitely still landing and even maybe at a similar connect percentage or at a connect total as Chocolatito in the second half. Ultimately, I think the difference maker in those subsequent rounds was the fact that Chocolatito just seemed to be far more composed on the inside. Estrada is capable of fighting on the inside, and he was still able to landing some beautiful left hooks. He's someone who's very athletic, very gifted, and has great hand speed, but the problem with him is he's not as strong as Choco on the inside. He's not as good at getting power into his shots. He sacrifices power for speed to an extent, so that's why for the most part during the fight, he wasn't really throwing with power. He was throwing with speed and not sitting down on his punches. And Estrada's best chance to beat Choco was to really not sit down on his punches and look to actually outwork him from long range. And as he was able to exercise it in those early rounds, that stopped Choco from getting into his element. But of course, down the stretch of the fight, and we noticed this with fighters like him and even someone like James DeGale, his defense tends to depreciate in second halves, whether that be due to fatigue or whether it be due to fatigue or maybe, say, a lack of concentration. I think it's kind of a contributing factor of both, as Estrada in second halves of fights is able to expend a lot of energy, but seems to really like a tear-up. And he's even shown that against opponents that he was expected to turn in more convincing opponents against, and he kind of wanted to put on a show against, such as like Cuadras and Argy Cortez in his previous fight, the Nacho Beristain-trained fighter. But it showed up again in this fight. He started engaging Choco on the inside, and Choco was beginning to kind of break him down. He began to figure him out. He made better use of his jab, and the more he started to sell out, I guess the less respect he sort of started to develop for Estrada's power, and the more Estrada was forced to fight out of the pocket a lot. But he, of course, got a second win in the last 2 rounds, but in my view, lost the 11th narrowly and ended up picking up the 12th round, making the fight 6 rounds apiece. To be honest, with the fact that I still have yet to score any of the 3 fights for Estrada, it really is, in my view, a bit of a shame that he was unable to pick up that Chocolatito ultimately was unable to pick up any of the remaining 2 fights, despite the fact that I believe, and in the opinions of most, he had a case in both. Ultimately, I can still come out of this fight not too angry with the fact that at least this fight was extremely hotly contested. Estrada did have somewhat dominant points in the fight early on, and he did definitely cement a very convincing performance in regards to a potential case for him to win. And of course, Chocolatito while he did show his great ability, he definitely did show that he was kind of wearing down a bit, and he wasn't the same type of ring general he was, say, earlier in his career. And he was not able to expend the type of energy he was in the first Estrada fight, where no matter how much movement Juan was using, Roman was able to still get inside on him. He was still able to lure him into pocket exchanges from early in the fight and keep the fight sort of within his sort of geography, as opposed to Estrada being able to just completely neutralize him with a jab and his footwork. And ultimately, that was the difference maker in the scoring of the fight, the fact that Choco was unable to make that sort of a mark early in the fight. But I still felt down the stretch of the fight that he definitely still made a case for himself to win. And the scoring of the fight, if I had to give it to someone, I honestly don't. I'm pretty confident in my 6-6 scorecard. I have 2 swing rounds. I feel like you could have maybe given the second round to Choco, and you could have given the 11th round to Estrada, which I gave to Chocolatito. Maybe if you want to be super generous to Choco, you could give him the 12th, but really it was a 7 rounds to 5 either way type of a fight, and I cannot really see many other combinations of a scorecard that you could come up with. But still, nevertheless, an extremely high-level contest. Both fighters are among the best in the pocket in the entire sport. Chocolatito and Estrada are 2 of the best offensive and defensive fighters in the sport. At least Estrada is one of the better defensive fighters in the sport when he's committed to it. But obviously, a lot of the time, he sells out. He tends to show a lot of carelessness. He's a rather free-flowing fighter. And he definitely fights with a chip on his shoulder. And we've seen numerous times him go against, lesser opposition and show a lot more holes in his defense, whereas when he's truly committed to it or sees his opponents as a threat, say a Milindo or Segura, and even a Brian Valoria to some extent, he shows, and of course the Chocolatito trilogy fight, he shows incredible variety in terms of his overall defensive maneuvers. Like, he was showing a pawing sort of a hand check with his lead hand. He was using that to kind of paw and control Chocolatito's head, which I haven't really seen from him in the past. That's certainly an element of his game that I think he's improved upon in terms of his variance with his lead hand. And I feel like that was definitely key to a lot of his success at keeping Choco at distance early. But yeah, nevertheless, congratulations to him and commiserations for Chocolatito. We'll see how far Chocolatito can go with his career, but obviously this is starting to look a little bit like the end, or close to it. He's still definitely capable of winning at world level, and he was certainly, I think, capable of winning the fight last night, but the judges didn't show him the type of, generosity that they've oftentimes showed his opponents. So be it. Estrada did deserve to win the fight, with his performance, in my view. I think both guys definitely, no matter who had gotten the decision, I feel like they would have deserved it, but I can't really be mad, and I still attribute full credit to Estrada for, winning this fight, even though I had it extremely close. Estrada, I kind of want to briefly talk about him for a minute, and his placement amongst the top fighters in the sport. Obviously, the subject of pound for pound is going to go on, as Chocolatito was a reigning pound for pound number 1 by consensus for a couple of years after Floyd Mayweather retired. And this was even past Chocolatito's prime. Chocolatito's prime really lasted from about 2012 to 2015. Those were the peak years of his career. In terms of his physical peak, it was from about 2008 when he first entered world level against Yutaka Nida, to then when he eventually moved up to super flyweight in 2016 and defeated Cuadras. And since then, he's been kind of on a slow decline physically. Well, actually, I don't even think it was a slow decline. I think it was a pretty rapid decline where he then eventually sort of plateaued and maybe started to just only experience incremental slippages in his physical capabilities at 115 pounds. So we're probably not looking at too much longer of a career for him, but he could still beat elite level fighters at those divisions just on his skill alone. He doesn't, thankfully for him, even though his style requires a lot of conditioning and an incredible amount of physical and mental fortitude, as he is a ruthless and relentless pressure fighter who throws heavy shots. His style, thankfully for him, is not too predicated on fast twitch muscle, which is the first thing to go, especially, in a pressure fighter and a guy who fights at those lower weight categories. Estrada himself doesn't, in my view, have a very extensive future ahead of him, as he himself is someone who relies on physical attributes such as, quick twitch muscle, as I've even seen in his right hand since really in both arms, but not the right hand, the left hook, since he, I think, got his elbow surgery in between the Dwayne Beeman fight and the Carlos Cuadras rematch. I basically saw that Estrada was starting to slap with that shot a bit more. That shot was not being thrown with as much velocity, I think due to the effects of that surgery and that elbow injury, which kept him out of the ring for over a year. And layoffs, which he has experienced quite a bit as of recent, do affect fighters like him. He is super rhythm-based, and he needs to be sharp to be at his, peak performance. He's not someone who has much margin of error, as his style is super predicated on his sharpness and his athleticism and his timing. And the fact that he does fight a high-risk style. He does fight in the pocket a lot, throw combinations. Those are attributes he does need. But, in terms of where he ranks in terms of the top fighters in the world, personally, I do think he belongs in the top 10 pound-for-pound rankings. I will probably release a pound-for-pound ranking at the end of this year. There's just a couple of fights that I do think need to pass. And one of those fights is the Kazuto Ioka versus Joshua Franco unification on New Year's Eve. But once that fight passes, I think we can start to properly assess. I think we're both guys, rank in the pound-for-pound rankings, I suppose. And I'd personally probably have Estrada around the top 5, top 10. Skillfully, really, should I say, the only thing that really holds him back, in my view, from being ranked even higher, like top 3, or maybe even solidifying a case or an argument for number 1 with, Inoue and Usyk, is the fact that his performances are obviously inconsistent. And obviously he does have limitations defensively. And the fact that, I think down the stretch of fights, he tends to, as I previously mentioned earlier in the video, the fact that he does have a lot of lapses in concentration. He allows his opponents to get into fights, land clean shots on him. Certain attributes I think you can scrutinize of him, and of course his resume. The fact that the second Rungvisai fight might have a slight asterisk due to the fact that Rungvisai fought basically one of the worst possible game plans he could have fought. In my view, him receiving a gift decision against Chocolatito, and, the third fight still being very, very close. Him not necessarily having a entirely convincing victory over him. I do think, ultimately, with the level of skill he's displayed, the fact that he does have 2 relatively convincing wins over Carlos Cuadras, and, if you want to examine his overall career legacy, he's arguably one of the top 15 to top 10 flyweights of all time. Milan Melindo, Giovanni Segura, and going to China to defeat Brian Viloria, who was red hot at the time, coming fresh off of a unification victory against Hernan Marquez. The fight previously, Estrada was coming fresh off of the loss against Chocolatito, moved up in weight to flyweight, and immediately took on Viloria and managed to defeat him on the cards. Juan Carlos Sanchez is another name that rings a bell on his flyweight record. Giovanni Segura, too, for those unfamiliar with him, was the guy who defeated a 105-pound and 108-pound champion. I think it was... it was Ivan Calderon. Yeah. So, when you look at his overall career legacy, he's a first-ballot Hall of Famer. Pretty much without a doubt. But, obviously, the fact that maybe he doesn't have a super convincing win over Chocolatito might rub people the wrong way. I still definitely rate his abilities. He is, when he's in his element, he's got some of the best footwork I think I've ever seen. And he is a very, very good counter-puncher, reminiscent of Juan Manuel Marquez. He can fight at all ranges. Not necessarily a master on the inside, but competent and phenomenal at mid to long range. He's got a very, very nice jab. And I think if he uses the type of variation he used in his jab in this fight, it'll give him a better opportunity if he's to fight Bam Rodriguez if he decides to move up, or Kazuto Ioka. Or even, Fernando Martinez, but that's obviously a very unlikely unification. Or, well, actually, I don't know. If Martinez, who I don't believe has any type of promotional pact or network exclusivity deal, can somehow ink, obviously gets by Jade Bonner in his next fight, and say they're able to maybe reach negotiations, Eddie Hearn shows some type of a willingness to pay for him, or maybe Zanfer. I'd obviously love to see that fight. Martinez, of course, poses a very good physical threat to Estrada, but Estrada, of course, has a significant advantage in overall skill. Ioka, in my view, that's the best fight for Estrada in the division, of course, assuming Ioka beats Franco, which isn't a gimme, but I do think Ioka will outbox him. Personally, I might get into that a little bit later in a subsequent video, but that in my view is the most intriguing fight involving Estrada, which I think can be very, very difficult. Ioka's counter-punching, I think Ioka's superior straight punching to Chocolatito, I think could be potentially a big difference maker. As we saw, the reason Rung Visai beat Estrada in the first fight is he was able to force him to reset with the 1-2 to the body. If Ioka can replicate the same thing out of the orthodox stance, I think he'd have a very, very good chance at outpointing Estrada. But, yeah. Those are my overall thoughts on the trilogy. The undercard, well, it was pretty interesting. I haven't quite seen the fights yet, but I'm going to watch them maybe tonight or tomorrow morning. I believe, right. So the fights involved Julio Cesar Martinez versus Samuel Carmona. The Mexican WBC flyweight champion fighting against the I believe a European sort of level fighter from Spain, and I heard apparently he looked extremely poor. Martinez is someone who is kind of giving off the reputation as someone who went on a very good run, but has definitely been found out. And I definitely did not speculate that the Chocolatito sort of legacy would come to an end at the hands of Martinez, as many people thought, because of his technical limitations, because his explosiveness is his greatest feature, the greatest feature of his game. When you take the fight inside, it creates a lot of holes in his high guard. And he's not a short puncher, and the fact that in this fight he's at, a foot speed disadvantage against, Carmona, who himself is a bit of a pure boxer, that definitely, I think, probably posed a lot of issues for Martinez. I haven't seen the fight yet, but that's what I'm assuming. I heard Carmona also broke his hand. Martinez was struggling to take the lead, and when you look at ultimately his fights at world level in the past, coming against guys like Charlie Edwards, well, Charlie Edwards himself was a bit soft and definitely stood in the pocket a bit too much in the fight, trying to utilize his angles, go counter for counter with him, and he ended up getting folded with a body shot. He beat Andrew Selby in the previous fight. Well, in that case, the Charlie Edwards fight was a no contest. The Andrew Selby fight was a legitimate victory and kind of his breakout into the world scene. But then when you look at subsequent opponents, Jay Harris was able to give him a lot of problems. He looked fairly explosive against... what was it? Yoel Cordova, the same guy who actually got kind of stiffed against Carmona on the cards in a Spain card under Sandor Martin, he was still able to actually... he looked pretty explosive in that fight, but nevertheless still had issues with Cordova, who was able to take the fight up close. And even momentarily stun Martinez with short punches. Like I said, the short punches cause him a lot of problems due to the fact that he arcs his shots so frequently. And the Christopher Gonzalez fight, who himself picked up a very big win on this card, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Rosales is someone who lacks the physical strength and brute force that Martinez has, even though he is a tough pressure fighter himself and a relatively big guy for the division. He doesn't really have the explosiveness to be able to hang with or push back Martinez, and Martinez was able to basically bully him around and beat him around the ring. And, of course, he beat Jay Harris, who himself is someone who really cannot handle pressure and is a bit weak to the body, but nevertheless was able to pull off consecutive rounds against Martinez and give him a lot of problems due to just, using lateral movement and being able to counter Martinez coming in, and the fact that his short punches just simply were able to beat Martinez, down the pipe. Of course, Martinez fought McWilliams. Arroyo was countered with short shots, but eventually started to sell out. Arroyo sort of punched himself out. Martinez was able to kind of play bully and was basically able to force McWilliams Arroyo to, I believe, quit from a headbutt, like a cut. I don't even remember that fight anymore. That was on the Android Quigley undercard. But that fight, of course, ended up a no contest, and yeah, he went in to the Chocolatito fight. Some people saying that his explosiveness and his youth would be too much for the more inactive and the older Chocolatito, and I was very, very convinced that he was going to get beat up and probably stopped, but he ended up losing a lopsided unanimous decision. So be it. The other fight, of course, was Christopher Rosales, who was the former WBC flyweight champion. He defeated Daigo Higa, and he took on prospect Joselito Velasquez, who has definitely kind of disappointed in certain areas of his career, but has shown a little bit more potential recently as he was able to settle some personal issues outside of the ring. He, a couple of years ago, severely disappointed, where he ended up having a draw against Carlos Mejia, who has a bit of a deceptive record. I believe is about 8-3, but his losses have come to guys like Christian Gonzalez and Yahir Alan Frank, who are all contenders or prospects starting to build themselves up through the ranks. And Christian Gonzalez is going to be fighting Jesse Bam Rodriguez for the WBO title at flyweight, and who's a very solid, outside mover boxer himself. But drawing with him was certainly a major setback, as he himself did not have a particularly impressive record. He picked up the most impressive, most convincing win of his career against Jose Soto. But Soto is someone who was kind of a prospect sort of gone wrong, as he lost a disqualification against Ganigan Lopez, the ex-108-pound champion. But in that fight, Ganigan was actually outboxing Soto, and Soto looked quite crude. Ganigan's lateral movement, his jab, despite the fact that he was smaller, he was still able to get around Jose Soto's length and his jab. And predictably, he looked quite crude, was still able to give Velasquez problems, but nevertheless ended up getting stopped in the 6th round. And going into the Rosales fight, I wasn't really too sure what to expect. Rosales was coming off of a defeat himself to Angel Ayala, otherwise known as Camaleon, who's a hugely underrated prospect and who I'm personally expecting to reach world honors. And if he's to fight Martinez next, I'm picking him to absolutely embarrass him. I'm telling you right now. If that fight is ordered, put all your money down on Ayala. That's my boy right there, by the way. Angel Ayala, Mexican prospect. he was comprehensively beaten in that fight. Lost just about every round, probably 10 rounds to 2, 11 rounds to 1. And Ayala was just able to comfortably outbox him, but Velasquez is just someone who, well, let's be honest, he's got some explosive features about him. He's extremely talented, but he's just not been able to make the transition from the amateurs to the professionals. And after the first 3 rounds where he had a ton of success, Rosales sold out, got close, started bullying Velasquez around the ring, and Velasquez showed extreme signs of fatigue from around the 5th and 6th rounds onwards. So, yeah, that signals probably the end of Velasquez making a significant run at world level for now. He's probably going to have to wait a few years and make significant improvements, maybe get a nutritionist or maybe move up. As a professional, he's been unable to replicate the success he was able to achieve as an amateur, where he was, of course, a medalist in the 2016 Rio Olympics. Very good win for Rosales, though, I will say. I'm quite happy for him to see him pick up a victory at this stage in his career. He's definitely shown a little bit of slippage. He's been, at world level at least, been matched extremely tough, taking on, Martinez and people like that. Of course, losing to Charlie Edwards was not exactly the type of thing you'd want to see for a fighter at his level, but, good to see him at least pick up a victory and beat someone he was, favored to lose against as an underdog, so that's really all I have to say.